afternoon.
Hi, Senator Walls, members of the committee. My name is Weston Miller, Westinmiller. I've clocked out for the day, so I'm here representing myself. Specifically, I'm here representing myself as an autistic adult who has recently outed himself in order to start engaging with this committee and with the legislature on some conversations that impact autistic people, but from which our input has been notably absent so far. First, I want to absolutely thank Senator Day for this great bill and for engaging me in this conversation. She's identified a critical diagnosis gap. LB 997 is awesome. I hope we can figure out how to make that happen. With that being said, with Senator Day's blessing, I'm going to use my few minutes to talk about why this bill still made me a little nervous when I first read it. And again, it's not the bill's fault. Please support this bill. I'm here and I'm nervous because of what very often happens next. The main reason I have kind of outed myself as autistic is so that I can, with some credibility, begin to question and hopefully complicate what I would describe as Nebraska's early diagnosis to applied behavioral analysis pipeline. Applied behavioral analysis, ABA, is one of the most common prescribed interventions for autistic kids. Its definitions are pretty vague, but basically ABA uses behaviorism, behavioral science to change behavior. According to the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts, ABA uses scientific principles to improve socially significant behaviors to a meaningful degree. It's the default recommendation for many diagnosing physicians, huge organizations like Autism Speaks. It's the go-to recommendation. Any autism-related Google search is fairly well dominated by pro-ABA companies, websites, parent blogs, things like that. What I need you to know, the whole reason that I'm here today, is that before we have any further conversation as a body about autism, I need you to know that there is a very strong perception among autistic adults and teenagers that ABA is actually really bad for us. I want to be super clear that this is not about the intentions of any ABA practitioner. It is about an inherently harmful framework that a lot of us have just taken as a given. It's a framework that I think could be accurately described and is described by many as autistic conversion therapy. Now, let me just recognize that it's already the yellow light. That's an enormous assertion I've just dropped in your lap, and I've only got 3 minutes. And I know there's folks in the room who are not going to love what I'm saying. What I'm asking is that you please engage with me and other autistic people about this conversation, that you don't have conversations about caring for autistic people without autistic people in the room. Again, I cannot thank Senator Day enough for being open to this conversation. I am not the most important voice or a definitive voice in this conversation. We've got to include Black and brown autistic people, of whom there are many, non-speaking autistic people, of whom there are many, autistic people with intellectual disabilities, of whom there are many. I'm here because I can be, and so I've decided to just sort of throw myself into the gate and see where it goes. So I have a ton to say. I'm out of time. If you have any questions, I would be thrilled to answer them.
Senator Hanson-Brooks.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Miller, and for your, I think your story is obviously important and will help many young people when successful, wonderful people can thrive. It gives hope to those who are younger and behind them. So you talked about the ABA, Applied Behavioral
Analysis?
Yeah, as a dangerous or inherently harmful framework. So what do you mean by that? And you also talked about it's basically autistic conversion therapy. So could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Let me pre-apologize that there is not a short or gentle answer to this question. So I promise I'm going to be as efficient as I can. But what we have to do for this to be meaningful is talk about the framework, but then talk about what is being offered as a new framework and why I don't think it's actually sufficient. So I'm gonna be as efficient as I can. And let me first just get on the record, even if I were to just concede like the deficit approach that we take to autism, which I don't concede it. Even so, we start with
the deficit approach? I'm sorry.
Sorry. So the entire principle, and this is an enormous argument that we couldn't possibly unpack today. So the deficit approach to autism is the one that the DSM takes, and the DSM is the DSM. It literally defines autism, ADHD, most conditions as based on deficits, right? So I'm diagnosed as autistic because of deficits in social communication, because of an adherence to certain rigid, repetitive behaviors that are marked as a deficit, an insistence or a deficit in terms of my resilience to certain sensory input, and that's how it's defined. That's contrasted with what would be called like the neurodiversity lens, which is to say like deficit compared to what? Like it's different. Yeah, it comes with challenges, but it's not like, it kind of challenges the idea that you must be worse in order to be to meet the criteria. That's so thanks for asking that. So even if I were to concede that, which clearly I don't, we should just point out that the DSM defines autism spectrum disorder as a neurodevelopmental disorder, but our really only approach to it is behavioral therapy. That's like a red flag just to begin with before we even address the conversation. Regarding the therapy itself, applied behavioral analysis, and I don't think this part's controversial, maybe it is, but it is just fundamentally about compliance and assimilation. Now, we live in a compliance-based society. Not all compliance is bad. Not all assimilation is bad. Compliance and assimilation, though, are not health outcomes for autistic people or for anybody else. It's my opinion and the opinion of a lot of autistic adults that ABA inherently devalues autistic people's predispositions. It devalues our consent. I cannot overemphasize the amount of unsolicited, unwanted touching of children that happens in applied behavioral analysis. It does not assume our competence. And as you can imagine, that is not a consequence-free train of thought. At best, it creates a slew of new problems as autistic kids grow up, like unhealthy relationships with things that we like, an inability to have an opinion on anything trivial or fun, prompt dependency, which is one of the things ABA purports to help with. At worst, and this is what I've distributed to you, is that there's research now suggesting a strong link between long-term ABA and increased PTSD. And anything that encourages autistic masking, which is a fancy term to say trying to get me to act normal, is proven to increase suicidal ideation in autistic people. Now, I am a white guy who was raised in a family who could pretty much always pay our bills. I'm more prone to shutdowns than meltdowns. I was hyperlexic as a kid. I don't have an intellectual disability, so I've had like the most posh autistic experience possible, right? And yet, my entire existence has been characterized by being in a state of pain and stress that I didn't understand. And I've spent my entire life trying to communicate my experience and understand my experience in the world as something other than me being fundamentally flawed, bad, untrustworthy. These beliefs are reinforced not by the people, but by the principles, I believe, that guide applied behavioral analysis. And I tell you that so that you understand how that informs, I think, my defensiveness against what I will call the new framework that's being asserted, which I would characterize as just sort of an out-of-hand dismissal of autistic people's criticisms of ABA. And let me just tell you how this conversation will go, because I have not invented these talking points, right? This is me having my experience, but also just learning from a lot of other autistic people. So what happens is an autistic person lays out their concerns with ABA, and then professionals will follow either in your inbox, in a hearing, in a different meeting, and they will very kindly and very compassionately say, I'm so sorry that was your experience with ABA, or I'm so sorry that that's your perception of ABA. Let me just assure you, we don't do it that way anymore, or that's not how our clinic does it. Our clinic is positive and it's evidence-based. And that's red flag number 2, is that phrase, which might seem weird because if there's a crew that loves evidence, it's us. But that phrase, evidence-based practice, in terms of applied behavioral analysis, is used to just dismiss our concerns. It implies a really scientific, health-driven model, which in the case of ABA is just deceptive. Now, ABA is evidence-based, but we have to ask, like, what is the evidence? What can it do? And no doubt, ABA can change behavior. It can increase compliance. Those are the goals. It can absolutely do that. Let me please reemphasize, those are not health outcomes. Those are not health outcomes. And we're now learning it's actually detrimental to our health. I know I'm talking so long. I'm almost done, I promise. But we have to address the conversation shift that's about to happen, which is I'm trying to start a conversation about ABA is harmful. What's going to be done after this is there's going to be a conversation to say, well, that was the old ABA, but now we do the new ABA, and it's good, and it's fine, so we don't need to worry about it anymore. I'm here to suggest that's not actually the case. And again, I want to just triple down on the fact that this is not about the intentions of anyone. This is not any practitioner trying to do harm. I don't believe that for a second. But even the kindest, most compassionate behavioral tech, applied behavioral analyst is still doing a couple of things, if they're actually doing ABA, that I just fundamentally have a problem with. First, they are primarily concerned with changing an autistic person's behavior and therefore the way that they communicate. There is no version of that doesn't at least a little bit communicate to an autistic kid the way that you're built is wrong. Second, they are devaluing our consent by prioritizing our compliance. And in that case, I don't think it matters if they're using rewards or aversives. That's kind of the contrast. Old ABA used aversives. We used isolation. The Judge Rotenberg Center in Massachusetts still uses electric shock aversives. But the new ABA, we use positive reinforcement, but I don't think that makes it better. In fact, I think that even the new ABA devalues autistic adults' intrinsic motivation, which in my opinion implies kind of like a moral untrustworthiness that makes me pretty uncomfortable, by just absolutely obsessing over positive rewards as a motivator. In this context, I don't believe there's really a difference between rewards and aversives. They're just looked at from two different angles. And that's what I meant earlier when I said that this therapy creates unhealthy relationships with things that we like. Because we know from experience, because we're not idiots, that those preferences will be used to manipulate us and manipulate our behavior. And then finally, I'm so sorry. This is no practitioner's fault, but something I failed to mention is that most applied behavioral analysts prescribe or suggest 25 to 40 hours a week of applied behavioral analysis. That's a part or full-time job, often for a toddler. I'm not a professional, but I can't imagine anything that a child should be required to do for 40 hours a week in addition to school and just like figuring out how to be alive. It just feels like a lot. So thank you for that generous question. I'm sorry for all those words. There's a lot of pieces to this. I just cannot concede we've changed, so don't worry about it. So I wanted to try to get all that out there. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. Senator Merman.
Thank you. And have you heard of option therapy?
I'm sorry?
Have you heard of option therapy as it has to do with
Option therapy? No, I'm not
autism?
familiar with that.
Okay, it sounds a lot like what you're talking about, only more of the positive reinforcement
Oh,
type
sure.
thing. But I do have an autistic child. She's on I'm sure you know, there's a broad spectrum
Sure.
of autism. She's on the lower scale, but that's the kind of therapy we did with her, or we did do with her for 2 or 3 years when she was really young. But just wondering if you'd heard of that.
Yeah, I have not heard the term option. Obviously, there's a bunch of different therapies available. I mean, lots of parents use, occupational therapy, speech therapy, floor time, that kind of stuff. So I'm still learning, I think, about all the options. I was very late diagnosed. I was literally raised by a parent who studied behavioral psychology, but I have not myself had to do like 40 hours a week of ABA or anything. This is me sharing stories of other autistic people. But I'll look that up. Thanks for mentioning that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Other questions from the committee? Senator Linehan.
Thank you, Chairwoman Wells, and really, really appreciate you being here today. So as part of what you're trying to say, or am I just hearing this, that there's an underlying assumption that there's something wrong with you and it has to be fixed, which in turn means it devalues you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, and I got to say, one of the most stressful parts about doing this, and the reason I was really close to not doing it, is like I can't say it enough times. I know nobody's doing this on purpose. Like I know that nobody says, I'm going to spend my career helping autistic kids because I want to do harm. I know that's not what's happening. And I would imagine there are a lot of behavioral techs who actually provide really good care in spite of what I consider to be a harmful framework. But yes, I mean, I watch YouTube videos. I'm literally putting myself through behavioral tech training to make sure I know what I'm talking about. And I watch these videos with just these matter-of-fact statements about the deficits of autistic kids. And we've got to make sure we care for them in spite of their autism. And we've got to make sure that they figure out how to have jobs and have friends and be okay. And it's all about overcoming what for me is just like a default state of being. And don't get me wrong, it's like not a walk in the park. Like my understanding of the whole word disability is it's not that I'm broken. It's that like the world was clearly not built with like me in mind in particular, right? Now I get other passes being like a white guy, but in terms of my brain, there's just a lot of basic stuff like, well, this clearly wasn't built by me or anyone who thinks like me. And so when I learn about kids at age 5 or 10, even some adults do rigorous ABA, and I hear that we're spending 40 hours a week with them as the only point of concern. Now, I know that techs care about environmental factors and they care. That's part of the new ABA too, is we want to make sure to acknowledge that like these kids are in pain. They're not doing this just to be bad, that kind of stuff. But when the only focus of change is like my behavior, it kind of, I don't know. I can't find a version that doesn't make me feel just a little crummy. Because and this is relevant in other legislation this body hears, what I can tell you for sure is that no autistic kid acts out just to act out. That's like a vile misconception. Now, if kids are acting out, autistic kids can misbehave just like anybody else can misbehave. Don't get me wrong, we're not better or worse than any other kid. But what is not a sign of autism is just like being mean or being violent or whatever. But what is a sign of autism is like being in a constant state of pain and not really being able to communicate it. So yeah, like when I was a kid, I'd scream and not know why. I'd hit my sister and not know why, but I also grew up
Thank
and
you.
figured it out. Thank you
Thanks
for
for
your
being
question.
here. Appreciate it very much.
Any other questions? I don't see any. Thank you so much for
Thank
your
you.
testimony. I appreciate it. Next proponent.